Hello, 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 everybody. Hi. Welcome to East City Bookshop. My name is Lainey Rose, and I'm the events manager here at East City Bookshop. It is wonderful to be with you all today, both in person and virtually, if you're watching that way. Who here is at the bookstore for the very first time? Ooh, welcome, welcome. So, everybody else, be on your best behavior. We want them to come back. We always have something on the calendar here, and our summer events are already in full swing. Some things I'm personally excited about on our calendar are a couple of community non-author events we have upcoming. We have a book bestie speed dating on July 31st if you want to come meet your new bookish best friend. And in August, we're hosting a one-off book club discussion of Yesteryear, the buzzy book that everybody's talking about right now. All the information about our upcoming events and our 14 different book clubs can be found on our website. Who here tonight is from our Really Reading Romance book club? Give it a more enthusiastic cheer, please. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Before we get to tonight's event, some housekeeping details, the fun stuff. Number one, if you could take a moment to silence your cell phones, everyone in this room would appreciate that. Number two, if you need a restroom, it's upstairs past the cash registers and the greeting cards. Number three, we will have time for questions tonight for both in-person and virtual attendees. So even if you're watching via Zoom, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we can see them and can ask on your behalf. And finally, most importantly, if you still need to purchase a copy of Thighs Wide Shut, that is upstairs at our cash register and can be purchased prior to the signing line. Okay, repeat after me. Where are the books? Upstairs. Where are the books? So after the event, when three people come up to me, where are the books? They are. Great, thank you. I actually first met Hayley at a housewarming party and was delighted to meet a local debut author. I was even more excited to learn about the book, a charming second chance romance about a young woman determined to finally embrace vulnerability and a love letter to anyone who's ever felt their body is a barrier to their happiness. I was even more delighted when we were approached about hosting an event, and the only possible answer we could give was an enthusiastic yes. So thank you all for being here today to show up and support a debut author with a bright career ahead of her. Whether you're a friend, family, or someone who's just heard buzz about the book, we are delighted to be here celebrating the release of Thighs Wide Shut. Our author of the evening is Hayley Fleming, who grew up in Florida, where she was raised by two novelists surrounded by alligators and English professors. Great way to grow up. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Music from Amherst College. Nowadays, she lives in Washington, D.C., doing nonprofit work by day and writing rom coms by night. In her free time, you can find her chatting with her romance book club, singing alto in a local chorus, and scouring the internet for budget flights to fun destinations. Joining us in conversation tonight is friend of the shop, Ava Wilder, who is the critically acclaimed author of How to Fake It in Hollywood, Will They or Won't They, and Some Kind of Famous. Her work is often described as gritty, messy, and raw, which is also why she is no longer invited to make the potato salad. She lives in Northern Virginia with her husband. Please join me in welcoming our authors of the evening. Give them a big old round of applause. And keep that applause up. It's a long walk out here.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you so much for coming out for the launch day of Thighs Wide Shut. Can we get another round of applause for Hayley? I printed out my questions and then left them in the printer, so I'm sorry I will be reading off my phone. But do you want to start off by giving a brief elevator pitch of the book for anyone who might not know what it's about?
Yeah, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. It's good to see so many familiar faces. I've been coming to East City Bookshop for like 5 years since I moved to DC, and it's always been a dream to do an event here. So I'm glad everyone is here. Thighs Wide Shut is my friends to lovers second chance romance. It's about a girl who's going through a quarter life crisis. She had a best friend in college who she messed things up with. And then, after not talking to him for 5 years, gets a second chance to do right by herself. And so they meet again, and she takes that second chance, and chaos ensues.
as it usually does. So this is your debut novel. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of your journey as a writer, your journey to publication?
Yeah, so this was the first novel I ever wrote, which is
Nice.
crazy.
That's amazing.
I had an idea for it. I started reading romance like more recently than a lot of people did. I started reading romance in like 2022. And pretty shortly thereafter was like there's something I want to see in the genre that I have not seen yet. And just kind of started riffing on that. It started as a hobby and then I became obsessed with it and did it at every waking moment and started like canceling plans with friends so I could write, which was crazy because I didn't have a book deal. Um, but I wrote like 6 drafts. I started querying, which is when you send your novel to literary agents to try to get representation. And then I got asked by a couple literary agents to rewrite it from a dual timeline novel. So, like, alternating chapters between when they were in college to present day, to a single timeline novel. And I did, and it was like the worst thing I've ever had to do. I rewrote like 50% of the book to do that. And then eventually landed a literary agent who sold my book like a year ago, and here we are.
Amazing. And I don't know if you guys know how unusual it is for your very first book to be your first published book. So that is an
I
incredible
got very
achievement.
lucky.
You got very, I mean, but it's not just luck. Like it is such, I mean, you clearly worked incredibly hard on it, having to do all these rewrites, and all the work you did really shows because it is just such a delightful reading experience. So do you want to talk a little bit more about the inspiration for it and sort of how it evolved over all of those different drafts?
Sure. So, Thighs Wide Shut follows a girl with vaginismus, which, if you've never heard of that, it's a condition where like your pelvic floor muscles seize up when they make contact with anything. So she discovers this the first time she tries to wear a tampon, and then she has a few other like really unfortunate circumstances in which she realizes what's really going on. And that was something I hadn't ever seen represented in a romance novel, which I thought was just like a huge miss for the genre, which is why I wanted to start writing it. What was your question?
Um, well, we could get more into this later, sort of more about
Yeah.
the development over the years, but I mean, I think that is such a great like being like I see something missing in this genre that I really think that I can bring to it is
Yeah.
such like
It's a different
it's
conflict than what you
yeah.
normally see in romance novels. And that just felt really interesting to me, like something really juicy that I'd never seen in a book before.
Yes, and it does feel and it feels totally fresh
Yeah. And it
as
made it
a
exciting
conflict.
to write.
Yes, and it feels very like because I think, when you're writing romance, there's a lot of like, what are some good reasons that these characters wouldn't be together? And there's not that many of them. So this is something that like is you're bringing something very new to the table and something very needed. And I think, people are really responding to it and are going to continue to respond to it now that it's out in the world.
Yeah. I'm very excited.
So you mentioned it's a quarter life crisis story. So Emma, she's 27, and that's an interesting age because it's like some people are in a place where it's like they're in serious relationships, they're kind of in the career that they're going to be in, they're kind of in a serious career, and some people are still kind of figuring it out. And Emma is very much in the latter category. So talk to me about that. Talk to me about writing a character who is kind of in that place where she feels like she should be farther along than she is.
Yeah. So the fun backstory to that is that when I started writing this, I was 22 and the characters were younger than they are now. And so the first time I sent it to literary agents, some of the feedback I got was like, you should age them up. Like, you
Oh,
should make them older
interesting.
than 25. And I was like, I'm not even 25. Like, I was like, what do you mean you want me to like make them 27? Like, I don't know anything about being 27. And I actually turned 27 next week, and then I'll finally be the same age
Wow.
as my book character. Um, so they were originally a little younger, which maybe made her quarter life crisis feel like it made a little bit more sense than it does now. So then when I aged them up, I was like, no, this is more of a thing that she's starting over. Like she's a little older, so it's more of a big deal that she's moving to a new place. She's quit her job. She was a teacher and then decided that was not for her anymore for a variety of reasons I talk about in the novel. And so she decides to pick up and move to Boston, which is where her best friend Joe is living. And I really love the idea of like a fish out of water in a romance novel. I think it's fun to like watch a character try to struggle to fit in somewhere where they like don't know a lot of people or like they just don't know how to act. And so when she moves across the country, she's very much a fish out of water. She's trying to figure it out. And I just thought that that meshed really nicely with like her getting a second chance to like deal with her medical condition and do right by herself and also like enter a new phase of her life.
For sure. And it really like you really did such a good job of making it feel so like visceral, feeling all of that confusion and kind of unsureness and being like, what is my life going to look like? What am I doing?
Yeah.
Am I like taking a bunch of steps back? Like,
Yeah, there's a lot
so
of
real.
bits about her like unpacking moving boxes, and I leaned too heavily into that at some point. People were like, "You have to stop talking about the moving boxes," and I was like, "It's really essential to understanding where she's at right now."
I mean, I'm 35 and I still have moving boxes when we moved in February.
Right,
So it's
right,
like,
right,
it's, you know, not limited to age. um, but I think also, you know, going into how strongly you feel that, like one of the great things about this book is your voice is so strong and so funny and so like you really are just rooting for her so hard. So, and I think voice is one of the hardest things to get as a novelist. Do you feel like that's something that was sort of innate for you or something that you had to work to develop, or how did you get such a strong narrative voice?
Yeah, I said to someone recently that like my theory for writing Emma's voice was that I wanted her to constantly be oversharing. Which she definitely does. Like that this whole book
It's
is
so
just
funny.
her like oversharing. Like even with herself, I'm like, you didn't need to think that about yourself. And it's interesting because right now I'm working on my second novel and it's in third person
Hmm,
and it's harder. It's harder to
interesting.
get that voice. Like I felt like when I started writing this in first person, I really was like, okay, I'm gonna be in Emma's head. Um and so I feel like for Emma that came naturally for me, which I was really lucky. I'm really lucky that that did. But I love Emma's voice. She's
Me too. She's
crazy.
great.
She thinks too many things. So yeah, she's a hoot.
That's so interesting to hear because my first few books were third person and I just wrote my first person book and I was kind of like, this is too close. Like, I
Yeah,
don't,
no, yeah. Some people
I
listen.
personally like having a little distance.
Some
So
people might read that sweatshop and be like, that was more information than I need
no,
to know
but
about
I
this
like
character.
experiencing it as a reader is like is so delightful. But
It's
it's interesting
visceral.
as an author to be like where we kind of naturally go, like
Yeah.
what is more comfortable to us. So this book is a romance. It's about Emma and Harrison rekindling, but it also is very much about Emma's personal journey. And so there's sort of, I don't want to say controversy, but people really like to argue about genre classifications, about what's romance and what's women's fiction, and how much the personal journey should take up versus how much the romance should take up. And I feel like this book straddles the line in a very interesting way. So, how did you think about that, and how did you approach it when you were working on it?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because I do think that there's a world in which this would have just been women's fiction and
Mhm.
not a romance, especially because the the point of her journey was not like, oh, she fell in love and therefore her problem was solved.
Right.
Like that's the opposite of the point. And so writing it in a way that didn't cross that line was really challenging. Like I wanted you to be able to follow her journey and like see how she decides to like deal with her shit in a way that is not like purely for the main male character.
Mm.
Um and so in that way like it's almost two separate journeys that she's going on. Like she thinks that they're connected at the beginning and that's part of her problem is she thinks she's like gonna do this for him and then
I
by
just
the
got
end
chills when you
yeah
said that.
and then by the end she's like actually that's like really
Yeah.
messed up that I thought that
Yeah. And
and
he says that too.
yeah and
Yeah.
yeah like when she says that well
No,
yeah,
no
no spoilers.
spoilers.
Sorry. But that's like part of her journey is realizing that she has to go on a personal journey and like not a journey like for Harrison or like not a journey even with Harrison. Like she has to go on her own journey, and that is hard to write because I was also talking about the journey of her like relearning someone who she used to know very well and kind of forgot how to know over 5 years. But I think of those as different journeys.
Yeah, that's I think yeah, the way they're woven together, you do such an elegant job with it. It was very, very well done. But speaking of that relationship, second chance, I think is one of the hardest tropes to write because you are writing a relationship where a lot of the relationship development has happened off the page. So talk to me about that. How did you develop that relationship? Because, and you also mentioned that it started as dual timeline, and now I think there's two major.
Yeah, so right now there are two chapters with flashbacks where I was like, I will not publish this book if these like they're so
No,
essential
they're
to
very
the story.
important.
But yeah, there were originally like 12 of those. So whenever
Wow.
someone's like, oh, wow, like you know their backstory so well, I'm like, damn, I have like 150 pages of it
I
that didn't
mean,
make it into this book.
I think you got some bonus
Um,
content on your hands.
yeah, man. If anyone wants to read a lot of flashback scenes, I have them. But yeah, so I almost feel like it ended perfectly. Like I spent literally years getting to know what they were like in college and like what the foundation of their relationship was, and that informed like how they interact with each other as adults, which is very different than how they interacted when they were in college for a variety of reasons. But um yeah, I mean that was like all in my head as I redrafted it, and like they're able to refer back to it in the way like you would actually refer back to a memory that you experience. And so I think that's because I did all of that like unnecessary additional writing for the first few
But
years.
it was necessary. That's so interesting. I love that because you really do feel the history there. And it's like, even if like it only matters what the author knows,
Yeah.
and then it'll come through to the reader, even if they're not reading that, 150 additional
Yeah. So
pages.
there's some scenes where they're like, oh, like remember when you came to visit me when I was studying abroad? I got chapters, y'all. Like
Wow.
chapters of that.
That is amazing news. I really do think you need to release those special edition. So you are from Tampa originally, as is Emma, and you mentioned her backstory of she was a teacher and she quit because she had some issues with the school board. And I think, and then you also, there was the piece that you wrote in People where you were talking about, um, I don't know if I don't want to spoil too many things, but I think both in the book, there's this sort of it's not a love letter to Florida's education system.
The
It's the
opposite.
opposite of a
Yeah.
love letter.
And listen, I will write a love letter to Florida. Like I love Florida, but yeah, like I'll spoil this. But
Yeah.
Emma, one of the ways that you can develop vaginismus is from a lack of sex education. And so part of Emma's backstory is that as a kid growing up in Florida, she received basically no sex education, and as a result like didn't understand her own body, didn't understand how it worked, and then like came to basically be afraid of how it worked. So that's her background with Florida. She talks about it a fair amount in the book, and she also was a teacher in Florida, and then for a variety of reasons, like got into a fight with her school board about some books and left. So, I mentioned she's a fish out of water. I think she's a fish out of water in a even trickier way. Like not only did she move to a new place, like she moved to a new place because she really felt like she had to start over, which is even worse. So
Yeah. Well, I think it was such like a nuanced look at the way that, where we grew up kind of shapes us, and we both love it, but also can recognize the ways that it sort of let you down and kind of shaped you in like a negative way. Um, and I thought that was really well done. Um, so talking about the the way you approach physical intimacy in this book, because her kind of the way that she is like physical intimacy and romance is a very big part of the genre. And this book in particular, her whole conflict is that she feels like she is not capable of physical intimacy, which is also blocking her from emotional intimacy. So this is an open door book. How, and I thought the way that you approached the sex scenes in this were really interesting. So talk to me about that. How did you conceive, how did you think about how you were going to approach that given sort of the conceit of this book and the way that the characters have to
Yeah.
approach it?
Yeah, so what I always tell people about this is that it's a very explicit book, but most of that is like in a very medical way. So like if you control F in my Word doc, I use the word vagina like 90 times. Um so they're actually in pretty close to the final draft was not a sex scene, and my agent was like, you got to do that, girl. Like you can't write this whole book about how she can't do that and then like she never tries to resolve that. And so that was a pretty late addition and was probably the hardest thing I wrote, simply because like the whole thing is leading up to that.
Right.
And all the ways I talk about her body and like she thinks about her body are in very like clinical and nervous ways for most of the book. And so in approaching that scene, I had to kind of figure out how to bring that energy into that space without making it like uncomfortable to read. And so you'll have to read it and see how I did. But it was hard to write because she thinks a lot about her body and how it works and like bringing it into like a actually romantic context instead of like her at the gynecologist's office is very different.
Right. Well, and I thought it was so interesting because I do think that's often a critique of romance, the way that it sort of treats penetrative sex as something as sort of like the only sex that counts. And when you have a character who is not able to do that, like you really sort of have to examine sort of how she looks at sex. And she has her friend who's sort of like challenging that, being like, well, I don't think that that's necessary. Like, I don't think you're necessarily looking at it the right way. Like, so I thought it was just very, like a lot of things that are taken for granted in the genre. I thought it was good that you were sort of breaking them down and kind of being like, well, this doesn't necessarily have to be this way. And you were kind of approaching it in an unconventional way, which I thought was great.
Thank you.
Let's see. So this was a writing process that was over many years, many drafts. Was there anything that surprised you over the course of this process?
I mean, I think how much the novel changed from the very first draft to what it is now is, I mean, it's probably not surprising, but like it's so different. It's a completely different novel. But every time I finished a draft, I was just so excited about how much better it was getting, which like duh. But I think yeah, like I surprised myself with my ability to do like major rewrites after every draft, and I think it's cool to look back at the like 8 or 10 drafts that I did of this novel and see like how each one evolved to become what it is now. So
It is funny when you do like a certain number of drafts, you're like, well, if I just keep revising this forever, then maybe one day it'll be the perfect book. And it's like,
yeah,
you can't do that.
no,
You just have to
exactly.
put it
And
out there, and
it
it is
was
what it is.
so much easier to do for this one because I like didn't have a book deal. So I was rocking with this draft for as long as I wanted. And now I have to write a second book and I have a timeline for that. I'm like, whoa, I can't do 12 drafts of this one.
I mean, you can.
I sure
You might get
could.
in trouble.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I one of the things I love about this book and about the process of writing it is that I was able to take my time and like think very critically about every part of every draft and figure out what was working. So there was just a level of intention in all of the writing that I'm really appreciative I got the chance to do.
Is there anything that you cut that you kind of miss?
There was this scene, a flashback scene, of course, where it was like one of their 21st birthdays and they were drunk. And it's just like 3 pages of dialogue with like no dialogue tags, just like drunken monologuing. And it was so good. Like it was no, like it was so good. And
I'm
someone
telling you, bonus
I'll
content.
send it to you. Yeah.
Yep.
And someone told me that they'd never seen someone like so accurately portray what it's like to be drunk at age 21.
Exactly.
And a lot of the things from the original drafts from when they were in college, I was able to kind of change the context and make the same ish things happen as they're like in their late 20s, but that one, like, you can't have a conversation like that when you're
No,
27.
so
So
21.
that one is lost to the sands of time.
Well, I don't think it has to be lost. Well, on the flip side, is there anything that you added in a later draft where you're like, this just made everything click into place? Like, I can't believe this wasn't here the whole time.
I mentioned that the most of the drafts didn't have like a sex scene, like a penetrative sex scene. And then once I added that, I was like, this did need that,
Yeah.
like, to bring it full circle. And so yeah, now I don't think the book would be the same without it, like without her having to talk about her body in that way. So I'm really glad I wrote that, even though it sucked to write. So
I feel like a lot of times the stuff that sucks to write is where you're like, damn it,
I
we
had
did
to do
need
that. Yeah.
So let's talk about just sort of like writing fitting into your life. So you have a day job. How do you balance writing with that? Do you have a writing routine? Do you have any rituals that you do?
I would say I balance it pretty poorly right now.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, so poorly. I do a lot of my writing in like short focus spurt. My fiance is laughing at me right now. He's like, "Damn, I haven't seen you in like 3 months. You've been writing." I write in like short focus bursts. So I will set a timer for 45 minutes and like brick my phone and throw it out the window and like lock myself in a closet with no Wi-Fi connection. And like
That's so smart.
that's the only way I can write. And like my cats have to be out of the room. Like no one can reach me. And I do that for like 45 minutes to an hour. And then I reach like a level of productivity that has never before been seen by man. But like I have to have no connection to the outside world in order to do that. And then I'm able to do like a short productive burst. So most of my writing happens like 45 minutes a day at weird hours. And then like once a month I'll reserve a full weekend to do absolutely nothing but write. And I go to 6 coffee shops and drink 8 matcha lattes and write 40 pages. But
So do you feel like you are, because just hearing that, I'm like, whenever I have a full day to write, I'm like less productive than when I'm like, I have 30 minutes to
yeah,
write.
I think like when I have a full day to write, my word count is typically not that high, but it's because then I feel like I have the space to do like research on things or
Mm.
go down rabbit holes, or just like write something for the heck of it to like see how it feels, to see if I want to use it later. um so I think that that's really important to my process, but not often super productive in terms of like actually putting words on paper.
But I mean, I feel like a big part of writing is not writing.
It is, but I don't like that because I'm
No,
pretty
it
goal
feels
oriented. Yeah.
unproductive, but it's like you do kind of just have to let your mind
No, I
wander,
just
and go
expose
down those
myself
rabbit
by
holes.
like not calling that writing, but that is writing. But yeah.
You know what? That'll do it. Um, so without spoiling things, do you have a favorite part of this book?
My favorite.
Or you can spoil it if you want. It's your book.
Well, it's the beginning of the book. So, well, okay, I'm switching gears. My favorite chapter of the book is the second chapter, which is the first flashback
Mhm.
chapter. It's during their first week of college, and it's when Emma and Harrison meet. Um, and she just has like a crazy experience with a different guy. That I had a lot of fun writing, and it's probably the scene that changed the least in all of my drafts. Like that is pretty close to what it was when I first wrote it on paper in like a moment of raw inspiration. And so I just think it's funny. She's crazy. She's like 18 and just wants to be cool. And she meets Harrison and she's like, this guy is a loser. He's a loser. And so I had so much fun, like just writing that interaction, and then like you see all the ways it comes back to them later in their lives, like the things that they said to each other and the way they met and the circumstances, it all comes back. And so that's my favorite chapter of the book, and like the only one I've reread since getting the finished copy. I'm like, I can't read it anymore, but I can read
Wow.
that second chapter.
I mean, that's a great chapter. And that was when I was like, okay, I'm locked in. I am on board. Whatever she does, I'm on her side. She's got me.
I just listened to a preview of the audiobook for the first time yesterday. Like I hadn't heard any of it, and I don't want to listen to the audiobook. Like
No.
that's gonna freak me out. But the preview was from that chapter, and it's like the moment when they first meet, and I was like, she's cooking.
Oh, I love
She like the audiobook narrator, but also me. Like
I love that. That is really the best feeling because I'm also like, I can't reread my books. I can't listen to them. But then, sometimes it's like, oh yeah,
no,
that's
the
great.
way the audiobook narrator did Harrison's 18-year-old voice like sent me into outer space. It was
Okay, well now I need to listen to
no,
it on
it's yeah.
audio.
I just listened to that chapter, but
So, as a debut author, talk to me a little bit about what that experience has been like. What's been your favorite part? Is there anything that's been sort of unexpected about this experience?
my favorite part has really just been like seeing people post about it and talk about it. I had a piece like an essay published in People magazine the other day, and it was about like sex education in Florida and vaginismus, and I had a bunch of people like DM me on Instagram and be like, I cannot believe that this is a real thing that exists, and like I cannot wait to read this book. And that was really special because I was like, that is
That's why you wrote
that's
it.
why I wrote it.
Yeah.
That's why I thought like people would want to read it. And so it's really special to see that like it's reaching those people, like the people who I wrote it for. Um, and so that's yeah, that's been the most special part for sure.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of crazy to be like, this story is going from, just these like words on a hard drive that you're kind of writing 40 minutes at a time to being like, other people are experiencing this. These characters are real to other people. Like, this world you created is real to other people. It's like, it's kind of a surreal, amazing thing. I think we're almost time for audience questions, but I can you give a little preview about what you're working on next?
Yes. So after just talking about how bad Florida was for Emma, my second book does take place in Florida. It's I call it my mermaid book. It's like kind of about mermaids. It's about if anyone's ever heard of Weeki Wachee Springs, it's a place. Yeah. It's a place in Florida. It's like this dinky little state park where these people wear mermaid tails and they do like underwater synchronized swimming shows in front of like this big glass wall, and you're in an underwater auditorium. I need to practice explaining what that looks like.
Yeah,
'Cause but anyway, so it's about mermaids, and I'm very excited about it. It's very like weird Florida. I keep pitching it as like if Carl Hyacin wrote romance, but I'm not sure romance
yes.
readers read Carl Hyacin, so that might not be a good pitch. But I love
I think
Carl
it's a great
Hyacin,
pitch.
so
That's
so that's
amazing.
that's what's coming up next
Well,
summer.
I cannot wait. Okay, I think we can have some audience questions. Anyone? Yeah.
I'm very excited about the book, and I was just wondering, since you talked about getting to work on this and not having like a book deal specifically and working on it for so long and living it for so long and so intensely, how difficult was it to now pivot into a completely different story with like more of a timeline on it after getting kind of as much time as you did with this one?
Sorry, I have to repeat all the questions. The question is, what was it like after living with this story for so long? What was it like to pivot into another story?
I've heard every author say this at like every book talk, but it's been weird that I've been so focused on writing the second book, but like also promoting the first book. Like I'm so far past Eyes Wide Shut. Like I turned it in, gosh, 8 months ago. Like I have not thought about it since then. And so I've been in a completely different world with the other book, which is weird to like hold space for both of those in my brain, especially because we were just talking about like I can't write more than one thing at once. Like I can't even think about what I want to write next while I'm working on this other book. Um, and so that's been kind of weird to try to wrap my mind around. But it's been a fun challenge, and I've been enjoying all of it. So
Any other questions? Oh, yes. Do you outline before you write, or do you just start writing?
I typically try to outline and then don't follow it. So I think both for Thighs Wide Shut and for the book I'm working on now, I outlined like 80% of it and then was like, I'll figure out how it ends when I get there. But then once I started writing it, I was like, that's not gonna work. So I am an aspirational planner, but in reality, I mostly just see what comes out on page.
You get there how you get there. Yes. Oh, yeah.
was really funny and I wrote that, or if you could the humor that you're
I think, sorry.
Oh, well, I guess talk about the humor in a book that is sometimes about more serious struggles.
Yeah, I think like the only way to talk about someone's pelvic floor in extreme detail and make it interesting is to make it funny. So, um, I think like I tried to make the parts that would be serious funny in order to make it like digestible. And I had a lot of fun doing that because it comes out in really weird ways that you will see when you read the book. And so I don't know, that was kind of just like a challenge for myself as I was writing it. And I for sure was like laughing at myself as I was writing it. Like I think I'm so funny. Um, so it's a lot of fun. I love like blending humor with the more serious moments. And I love when people say it's funny because now I know I'm right. So
Yes, you're very right.
thank you.
Did you have a question? Yes.
and I'm curious if I feel like Florida does really best reputation, so I'm curious if that's just like you're writing what you know, or you're like this is a real place with so much to offer, and I want people to like understand that I love this, so I want to talk about it.
Talk about the Florida representation in your work.
Yeah, I would say that like it's omnipresent for Emma because it is for me. Like it hangs heavy over me, not in like a hangs heavy over me necessarily in a bad way, but like that's such an important part of like who I am as a person. Not just the fact that I grew up in Florida, but like the way people think about Florida as a place, like that I think um like factors into like the way I think about myself or people think about me maybe and so uh, I wrote Emma as a character from Florida because I was like writing what I knew in that case and for her I don't think that Emma like dislikes Florida, doesn't like that she grew up there, but like she went through some tough things that I think like are things that would only happen in a place like Florida, or not would only happen but like are a result of her growing up in Florida. um but I also like I think Florida is the best place in the world. Like I love going home to visit my family. I think it's the most beautiful place in the world. I am loving writing my second book that actually takes place in Florida. And so I think like holding both of those things together in my brain at the same time like could only be put on page in a character like Emma and like in the characters I'm putting in my second book. So I just think it's interesting to like think about that dynamic and write about it. And I have a lot of fun doing it because I do like I think a lot about Florida and what it means to be from Florida. And so I'd like to make everybody else listen to my thoughts on that. Yeah.
I'm so excited for the full Florida experience in your next book. Um, any other questions? Oh, yes.
I'm book club, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how community plays a role in your writing process, writing communities, book communities, if they did that all.
Can you talk about the role of community in your writing process, either writing communities or book communities?
I made everyone I knew read drafts of this novel. So like raise your hand if you read an early draft of this novel. Yeah. I had no reservations about making people read it. Like I probably should have, but I didn't. I like needed people to read it to feel like it was real and get real feedback from people who weren't like obligated to give me good feedback. Not that you guys weren't obligated to give me good feedback, but um, I also have a writing group, a bunch of women who all live in different places, and they've been very integral to my process. Partially in reading the novel, but more in just helping keep me accountable and like meeting every so often to talk about what we're working on. So I love talking about writing both with like my friends who put up with me talking about writing and also with people who also right. And it keeps me motivated, it keeps me excited. And I think it's so important, especially since writing can be a very solitary task. Just, when I'm locked in my closet without my cats and like no Wi-Fi, that can be tough, but then it's also balanced with moments where I get to talk about the process with people I care about. So, yeah.
Yes.
It was
Was this always the title of this book?
So it was not always the title. The original title was Opening Up for like the first three drafts, which I think is pretty funny, but is not as funny. And then my fiance started jokingly calling it Thighs Wide Shut. I was like, that's so dumb. I was like, that's a stupid title. And then I was like, actually, that's kind of funny. And then it became like, okay, if my goal is to get a literary agent to open my email about this book and the subject line of this email says Thighs Wide Shut in it, like they're going to open that email. And so then I kept it when I was querying. And then we were like, well, we need editors to open these emails about the book. So we kept it when we were pitching it to publishers. And somehow I've gotten this far without anyone asking me to change the title. So I didn't come up with it. It was my fiance. And yeah, it's funny. It it makes me laugh when I hear it still, but it was not originally the title. It started as a joke, and now we've come this far.
Literally everyone I've told that I'm doing this event has been like, that is an incredible title. Like,
Yeah, I called a different bookstore today by my apartment to like see if they had copies in stock for me to sign, just because I was like, I want to go see my book on a shelf. And I called and I was like, do you have Thighs Wide Shut in stock? And the woman on the phone was like, what? She was like, she was like, eyes. I was like, no, thighs.
oh, I love that. Yes.
It's in the closet. And you work on you're dumping in different places, but you're not connected to any research.
Yeah.
When you're in the closet, do you have goals that you're trying to reach?
Um, if I'm trying to like put new words on paper, I will try to write 1,000 words in one sitting. So like three-ish pages. If I'm revising, typically I'll try to revise like a full chapter or a full scene. And I do all of my writing and all of my revising in chronological order. Like my brain does not work that way. I can't jump around the story. Otherwise, I'll have no idea like what I wrote and referenced when. So yeah, typically I either have a very specific word count goal or like a specific scene that I am trying to finish while I'm sitting in the closet in the dark with no Wi-Fi. Yeah.
It's funny because 1,000 words doesn't sound like a lot, but you have a book in 3 months. If you write 1,000 words a day, it adds up.
Yeah, we got to a point with my second book where I was like, I have to write 2,000 words a day, and that's brutal.
That's tough.
That's brutal.
Other question? Yes.
And then came to the romance genre, like only a couple of years ago. And I'm wondering, and now like you're my romance authority, so clearly dug in deep. Um, how did you land on romance, and what out of because you're well read in a lot of genres, why is that one that you chose to write in?
Coming from a very literary background, how did you land on romance as the one you wanted to write?
So, I love that writing a romance novel feels like a puzzle to me because when you pick up a romance novel, you know it's going to have a happy ending. So like you know what the ending is going to be. And so what the interesting part is for readers is how you get there and like how the pieces like fit together to get to that ending. And so I just think that that's a really interesting challenge as a writer, like how to figure out how to make that interesting even though the reader knows where it's going. Um and so I have a lot of fun like, thinking of all the different twists and turns that it can take that like take the reader in unexpected ways, even though they ultimately know like they're going to end up together. So yeah, I think it's an interesting intellectual challenge, and I have a lot of fun doing it, and I have a lot of fun reading it and seeing how other authors do that. And so that's how I ended up there, and also it makes me happy. So
Other questions? Yes.
Where are they?
What is the perfect setting to read this book?
Oh my God. I don't know. Um, like, hmm. Well, Emma lives in a like crappy basement apartment. So when I think of people reading this book, I'm like, they're in a crappy basement apartment. So like I think, indoors under a cozy blanket with a cup of tea. Um,
On a beanbag.
on a bean, yes. There are bean bags in this book. I don't even like sitting on bean bags. Is it which author is it that like asked the question about like would this character sit in a bean bag? Is that Sarah McLean?
Is it?
It's Sarah McLean, right? She at events will be like, would this character sit in a beanbag?
That's
My
such a good
characters
question.
would sit
Yes.
in beanbags, but I don't know that
Wouldn't
I
do.
would.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you could read it in a beanbag. But yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, yes. Were there any authors or books that influenced or inspired your style?
I think that I mean the part of my writing style that I have the most fun with is the humor, and the authors that influence that the most are like Sarah Hogel, um more recently Ellie Palmer. I think their books are so funny. They're kind of outlandish humor is what I like to draw from in my books. Um but I the first romance novel I ever picked up that got me into the genre was People We Meet on Vacation because I'm just like other girls. And
That's such a good one, though.
it's so good. Guys, it's so good. But and so I mean the first romance novel I ever picked up was like a dual timeline Friends to Lovers. So when people were like, you need to change this from dual timeline, I'm like, guys, Emily Henry did that. Like, what do you mean people aren't gonna like this? Like, people love People We Meet on Vacation. Um, and so yeah, I mean, I read so widely in the genre. Like, there are also books where like the tone is very different, but I love their character work, like your books.
Thank you, finally.
Yes. And like Regina Black writes some of my favorite
Yes,
books because the
amazing.
characters feel
Amazing.
like more real people than real people actually are. Um, so I think I draw my inspiration like in bits and pieces from all over the genre, and I have a lot of fun doing that.
Anyone else? How are we doing on time? Okay, who wants to be the last question? Yes.
So yeah, I'm just curious if maybe in like the for Lost Four, if you explored some of them, or if that's something you want.
Are there any supporting characters that you would want to explore more in the future?
Yeah, so I don't know if I would write a full novel about any of them, but Emma's best friend Jo is like really integral to the plot for a variety of reasons. She's kind of Emma's voice of reason when she's not thinking reasonably. And when it was dual timeline, I did like show the beginnings of her relationship with her partner Macy. So I had a lot of fun like thinking about that and that as like a contrasting point to Emma's relationship. Um, at the beginning of the book, you'll see Harrison also has a girlfriend and soon ex-girlfriend, who I had a lot of fun writing because it would have been really easy to make her like suck.
Yeah.
But she doesn't. And so like that was interesting to figure out like how to shape that character in a way that wouldn't make readers mad, but would make her feel like a real person who Harrison like would reasonably have dated. And so I think like in another world I would have loved to explore her story more because right now she's kind of irrelevant. Like she's just a plot device. But um yeah, but I love that question because I love like writing my side characters and exploring who they are. So
I would also love to see more from her. Let's get her redemption arc. Okay. Well, can we get another round of applause for Hayley?
Wonderful, wonderful. What a fabulous conversation. And if you need to purchase a copy of the book, where are those books? Wonderful. I'm going to send our two authors off to our secret little green room area. Let's give them another round of applause as they head off. Don't worry, they're not gone forever.